Hello, good whatever time you are taking this online course. My name is Marissa Schuh. I'm with University of Minnesota Extension, where I focus on integrated pest management and horticulture, including greenhouses. My background is in entomology, so I'm going to kick off our course today by talking a little bit about the pests we encounter in greenhouses and the general groups of biocontrol agents we can potentially use to reduce those pest numbers. So, really broad today. We'll just be talking about, all of the small, fast reproducing pests that end up inside greenhouse plants. And we'll give a really broad introduction to the types of predators we can introduce to deal with these pests. And the rest of the course, we'll go way more into depth about these pests and these predators. So, thinking about the pests, we'll start with them. How do they get into our greenhouses in the first place? They most often enter on plant material. We're bringing in all kinds of stuff in ornamental greenhouse production, and these are tiny, tiny insects that like to hide in nooks and crannies, so they can enter the greenhouse even when we're trying to keep an eye out for them. They survive in the greenhouse on green plant material. Most of these insects would not do very well outside in a Minnesota winter, but because our greenhouses have a little bit of protection, there's crops growing in there, there's weeds growing in there, that provides them places to survive and continue to reinfest once they're in the greenhouse. So, what kind of insects are we thinking about here? First one we'll talk about is thrips. So thrips are small, like a millimeter in size. There's many species we deal with in the greenhouse, and they're a little bit different than a lot of other insects because they have a rasping mouth part. This is a little bit like that straw-like mouth part we think about with things like aphids, but instead this one's a little bit more rough, a little bit spiky. So the damage they cause when they feed on plants is a little bit more dramatic. So here we can see this bronzing type feeding caused by the rasping mouth part of a thrip. So they're bad because one, they cause visible plant damage that customers will notice, and two, they can vector all kinds of viruses. So viruses, once they feed on infected plants, they get circulated inside the thrip, and when the thrips go and feed on an uninfected plant, the virus can be introduced into it. So all kinds of viruses can hop from plant to plant and from species to species if there's a large thrips population in a greenhouse. Another frustrating thing about them is that they have a really fast life cycle. So here's what our thrips life cycle looks like. So the adult and nymph egg stages, those are all on plants. So our adult thrips, they can lay 100 to 300 eggs depending on the species. The nymphs will hatch, they will feed on plants, they will then go into the soil, into the growing medium, and pupate, change forms, and come out as adults. And the cycle repeats, and this life cycle takes about 2 weeks. So, with 2 weeks' time to complete this life cycle, each adult laying up to 300 eggs, that can really dramatically grow their populations. The most common species of thrips we're dealing with in the greenhouse are western flower thrips. So these are small, about a millimeter in size, kind of shaped like a grain of rice, kind of tapered at each end. They're yellow. They're attracted to yellow sticky cards. You'll see them there if they're in your greenhouse potentially. And they vector a lot of really gnarly viruses. So if you're someone who is growing ornamentals as well as vegetable starts, these are a pest to look out for because they can really mess up your vegetable starts. Next group we're going to think about are aphids. So like thrips, these guys are small and they're really quick to reproduce, but they're even faster than thrips. And this is because female aphids are able to clone themselves and give live birth. So you don't even need 2 aphids to start a population. You just need 1 female aphid who can crank out tons of little female clones who are then able to grow, give live birth, and really blow up that population. They damage plants with their straw-like mouth part that they use to suck out plant juices. They suck out so much plant juices that they can't even deal with it all, leading to honeydew production. So at the end of aphids, they have these 2 stovepipes where extra plant sap is just kind of spit out and ends up on the plant surface. So this causes plant leaves to get sticky and produces sooty mold, which is when that honeydew gets moldy. So your plants get covered in a black, sticky substance that can't be removed, looks ugly, and damages the plant. These guys can also transmit viruses, and we have many different species of aphids. Sometimes they're somewhat plant specific in what they hang out on. So here are some of our common types of aphids we see in the greenhouse. So chrysanthemum aphid, not our typical green aphid. They're a little bit more darkly colored. Peach aphid, which despite their name feeds on lots of different kinds of plants. Cotton melon aphid, again, despite its name, feeds on way more than cotton and melon. All these guys, again, can hang out in greenhouses, reproduce really, really quickly, and cause lots of different types of problems. Our next group of pests are whiteflies. These guys are, again, small. The adults look like a small white fly. The adults feed on plants. So do the immature stages, which are really, really small. The best time to figure out what kind of whitefly we're dealing with is when they're in this kind of pupal stage. Depending on the species, they'll either be covered in white hairs, which means a greenhouse whitefly, or they might be hairless. I think they almost look like a tiny horseshoe crab. Maybe that's not helpful, but that's what they look like to me. If we're seeing more of that hairless, structured pupa, we're more likely to have a sweet potato type whitefly. These guys are like aphids in that they produce honeydew. They can lead to sooty mold, and they vector some diseases. Not an insect, but another quickly reproducing relative would be two-spotted spider mites. These guys love hot, dry conditions. They are pretty rough feeders. So they cause leaf bronzing, leaf stippling, leaf distortion, and they can also produce webbing on the plants they're feeding on. So you might notice the webs they cause encoding leaf tips before you notice the mites themselves, where they get their name spider mites. And again, small, quick reproducing, fast reproduction, everything we've been talking about with all these bugs. Our next group are mealybugs. This is a type of scale insect. There's a couple different species, and again, they're kind of like the whiteflies, where we can identify them based on hairs and stuff like that. So some parts of their life stage are mobile, like the crawler life stage, which is what they are when they first hatch from eggs. They crawl out and they look for somewhere to hunker down. Then the instars and the adults are somewhat immobile. They just kind of hunker down, feed, secrete honeydew, give buyers the heebie-jeebies, all that good stuff. So what they look like outside of a black and white drawing, we have some types of mealybugs that feed on roots, but the ones we're primarily concerned about in greenhouses most of the time are our citrus mealybug and our long-tailed mealybug. So depending on the pattern of striping and the length of the filaments you're seeing coming off of the body, that can help you figure out what type of mealybug you're dealing with in your greenhouse. So those are the general kinds of pests we're dealing with in the insects. In the greenhouse, we have things that are small, quick to reproduce, and can spread viruses. It's pretty common across a lot of them. So when we have pests, we oftentimes have things that have evolved to eat those pests. So we're thinking about things we can introduce in greenhouse. We're thinking about predatory and parasitoid insects and mites that oftentimes are very focused on feeding on one specific species of pest. So understanding your pest is really important when you're picking out a biological control agent. So here we're just going to go over the broad groups of biocontrol agents that you might potentially investigate, depending on what you learn in this course and what kind of pests you're actually seeing on the ground in your greenhouse. So maybe the most well-known biocontrol agent, one of the more well-known beneficial insects more broadly in American culture, are ladybugs, lady beetles, they can also be called. So we have lots of different species in Minnesota and that we can use in greenhouses. Not all of them look like the traditional red with black spot ladybug we're used to seeing. So if we have them in a garden or in a greenhouse, we will see all life stages are feeding above ground and on leaves. And actually, the most beneficial life stage to have around is this larval stage. So they don't fly away like adults do, and they're the hungriest. So these larvae are ferocious predators of small, soft-bodied insects like aphids. They suck out plant juice, they kind of consume all of the aphid and just leave behind a withered husk. Then they move on to feed on more aphids. So in their larval lifespan, some ladybugs can eat upwards of 200 aphids in their lifetime. So a couple of these guys can really do a lot of damage on aphid colonies. The next general group of biocontrol agents we can use are called parasitoid wasps. So these are a little bit different than the hornets or yellow jackets we're used to dealing with in our yards and when we're trying to eat ice cream or drink soda outside. These guys are very different. These guys are solo, so they don't defend a hive, they don't really bother humans, and they're really, really small. We're not even likely to notice a lot of our adult parasitoid wasps. But these guys are super, super useful for controlling pests because they've often co-evolved with other insects and they depend on that insect to complete their life cycle. So our example here would be, this would be a parasitoid wasp that has evolved to use aphids to complete its life cycle. So what this looks like is the adults are able to smell and sense where aphids are. They find a colony and they lay their eggs inside of the aphid. Then it's kind of like the movie Alien, where the baby wasp is feeding on that aphid, growing and growing. Eventually, the aphid dies, an adult wasp emerges and goes out to hunt more aphids, or whatever it is that that specific species life cycle is based on. So this is kind of a drama that happens at a small scale. We might not notice it unless we're really looking for it. So here we have our adult wasp here. This is one that is focused on aphids. So we have our egg laying. Here we can see There is our baby wasp feeding on the inside of our aphid, which is starting to look pretty sick. Eventually, the aphid turns white. We refer to this as an aphid mummy. That's a sign that you have a parasitoid around. Eventually, that aphid is just a crispy little dried out husk. An adult wasp will emerge, and that guy's going to go out to repeat the whole cycle over again. So super useful, beneficial insect if you know exactly what kind of pest you're dealing with. So again, there are different species that target different kinds of insects. So for example, this would be a species that is targeting tomato hornworm. And each one of these white sacs, these little white things that look like grains of rice, is actually a pupa of the parasitoid wasp. So one wasp is going to emerge from each one of these white sacs and go off to find more of these caterpillars to kill. Same with this imported cabbage worm. This was once a cabbage worm. Now that worm has been totally consumed, and each of these pupa are going to produce a wasp that goes and hunts more imported cabbage worm. Here's a close-up of what our aphid mummies look like. So again, these are the aphids where they've kind of totally been hollowed out by the parasitoid wasp. And we can see here there's a hole where it emerged from. Here's more of a healthy aphid. So we have white, crispy husks of aphids that have been attacked by parasitoids. Another group that can attack a lot of our greenhouse pests that we don't always think about are syrphid flies. So the adults of these look like bees or wasps. If you've ever been out on a sunny day and maybe you're sweating, you might notice sweat flies, are sometimes called, hovering around you, but you're not getting sting, you're not getting bit, they're just like hanging around. So these are sometimes called sweat flies, hover flies, flower flies. They have a lot of different names. The adults are whatever, they're pollinators, but the larvae, that's what we're interested in for biocontrol. So larvae are actually maggots that hunt aphids and other soft-bodied insects. So they kind of look like a caterpillar, maybe even like a booger, I don't know. Green blobs that have a mouth part that they use to attack aphids. So maybe not what you'd expect, something that looks like that to do, but a secret, voracious, potential biocontrol agent in our immature syrphid flies. Another insect where the larvae are really vicious and we might not expect would be lacewings. So we have species of lacewings where the adults are either green or brown. You oftentimes see these guys flying around a porch light at night, and the larvae are actually the stage that eat the most pests. So the larvae look nothing like the adults. They have these huge mandibles that they use to attack and then suck the juices out of things like aphids and thrips. These guys are nice in the greenhouse because they don't have wings, they don't fly away, they're not super mobile. They're pretty active hunters and they're very aggressive hunters. They can be a really nice biological control agent depending on what kind of pests you're dealing with. Because you can just watch it. Feels emotionally good. If you've ever struggled with aphids, to watch an aphid just get wailed on. Another biocontrol agent we can use are minute pirate bugs. These might be listed online as aureus species. So these guys are, again, as the name implies, very small, like a millimeter in size. You might have noticed them in the fall when they run out of aphids and mealybugs to eat. Sometimes they use their straw-like mouth part instead of to attack a mealybug, as we can see in that image there. They use it to poke in human skin, and it hurts. So as an extension person, I deal a lot with the annoying side of these bugs. But on the positive side, both the nymphs and the adults are very voracious feeders on things like aphids, thrips, and mealybugs. So that is another option we could potentially use. We also have things like thrips and mites, where some species within that group are our most annoying pets, our most annoying pests. But we also have species within that group that are some of the best predators. So we have some species of thrips that instead of feeding on our plants, actually feed on other thrips. So in the case of thrips, there's a predatory species that look a little bit different than our pest thrips. So in this case, this predatory species is a little bit bigger, a little bit more darkly colored, and again, really hungry predator that instead of using their rasping mouth parts to poke into a plant, they're using those rasping mouth parts to attack other thrips. Same thing with mites. While two-spotted spider mite is a huge pest, we can introduce species of predatory mites that are really aggressive and active hunters. So it's like a miniature scale WWE match where your pest mites and aphids can get taken down. So that's kind of an overview of what our pests are and who our potential predators are. To make these systems work, that is a lot of what this course is going to cover, but it's really important to understand the exact species of pests you're most likely dealing with and how big of an issue they are for you. Biological control, getting it to work in a greenhouse, is a little bit of a science, but there's also a lot of art to it. So this course will give you a good introduction, some good people to know in Minnesota if you're going to try to get one of these systems to work, because it can be a little bit tricky to figure out all the moving pieces. All right, so that is our little introduction here. Thank you for your attention. My name again is Marissa Schuh. There is my contact information if you ever want to hash out any pest issues that you're having in your greenhouse, garden, or farm. And I will let the rest of our course presenters take it away and really get into these pests and predators in depth.